Hello, this is Rick Powers coming to you from my home office for Western Technical College. Basic Statistics, Introduction to Learning Plan 4. So I want to take us through some very important introductory remarks having to do with this learning plan, because it's in this learning plan that we have the difference between a confidence interval and a hypothesis test. And I want you to understand the difference between those. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my screen here so that I can write some things down and you can see them. All right, so what we're talking about is comparing different methods of statistics. And specifically, what's going on here is that we want to understand the purpose of statistics and how it is accomplished by these two different methods. So the first thing we need to do is to consider the purpose of statistics. And the purpose of statistics is to know what to expect. So what we're dealing with here is the question, how am I going to figure out what's possible to happen or what's likely to happen based on my measurements in some particular way? And when we do this, many times what happens is that we're looking at a sample which does not include all the data, and we want to understand the population. And this thing is called the process of statistics. Using a sample to understand the population. So when we're trying to do this then, and we say, I want to understand, for example, all women over 65 in terms of their health needs. Well, you don't have access to all women over 65. But if you say, I have access to information about hundreds of women who live in La Crosse who are over age 65, then you say, okay, well, I've got something here, and maybe I can use this to make more general statements about what might be true in general. Or at least maybe if I have a sample of a certain number of women over 65, I can think about how that might be true of all the women in La Crosse. Maybe I don't have access to all the women in La Crosse over 65, but I have access to some. And so then I use that sample to understand the population. Or if I want to, for example, know something about how often people go to the hospital, and I make some phone calls, I might get 50 people on the phone. And then I want to ask the question, how are the numbers associated with these people related to all the people in La Crosse, or something like that? All right, so we've talked about that, the process of statistics. Now, when we deal with that, there are two main methods. The two main methods that we have are, first of all, the confidence interval. What does the confidence interval do? Hopefully you've seen this enough times that the confidence interval uses a sample to create an interval estimate of a population measurement. So if we want to know something about blood pressure average, then we could measure a blood pressure average of a sample and get a confidence interval for the blood pressure average for the population. Or we could do the same with a proportion, or we could do the same for a standard deviation. Now, when we do this, this gives us pretty good information because it's what we want. We want to know about the population based on the sample. And as it turns out, this particular method is being used more these days in modern research compared to even 5 years ago. A few years ago, most research dealt with something called hypothesis testing. And what happens with hypothesis testing? It uses a sample to prove a difference. And specifically, the difference that we start with is between a standard number and a population measurement. For example, the mean hours spent in exercise in lacrosse is greater than the national average. I don't know if this is true or not, but it might be something we would want to try to prove. Okay. And when we're saying the mean hours spent in exercise in lacrosse, specifically, this is a population mean. We don't just care about a sample. We can do a sample and we can find out what it is, but we know that samples are not accurate. Samples do not tell us exact numbers because they're just samples of a few people. And then what we can ask the question, if we have a sample, can we prove based on a sample that a population measurement is either higher or lower than some standard number that we're given? And we have to be given what that standard number is. Now, as the course goes on, we're going to be using hypothesis testing in many different ways with many different situations. But here's where we start. The main idea, though, remains the same. We're trying to prove a difference. By using a sample, we're trying to prove some kind of a difference that's related to a population. Now, as it turns out, hypothesis testing is pretty complicated. There are a lot of intermediate steps that are involved. And specifically, if I go out to Blackboard and I go to the assignments section and I go to learning plan number 4 and I say, what's going on here in learning plan number 4? And I click on something. Okay. I'm going to see steps for hypothesis testing. There are 3 different approaches to hypothesis testing: the classical approach, the p-value approach, and the confidence interval approach. And you're like, well, wait a minute, you said a confidence interval was different than hypothesis testing. They're actually very closely related. You can use a confidence interval to do a hypothesis test. Now, as you go through the notes and you go through the videos, then there's explanation of how this is actually supposed to work. But there are 3 different ways, 3 different methods of doing hypothesis testing, and those are listed out here in the notes. And then there's something called the long form of the conclusion, where you have to describe your conclusion in very precise ways, which are not easy to come by because you've never seen this before, more than likely. And so then it's a process that has a lot of details, a lot of vocabulary, a lot of definitions. It's not easy. However, if you want to say the good news is that hypothesis testing has been considered to be not as good as confidence intervals, because confidence intervals give us more specific information about a population number, whereas hypothesis testing is only asking the question, is there a difference? And so then that's the only piece of information we get from hypothesis testing, whereas confidence intervals give us more. All right, so that is the introduction to these different methods of doing statistics that you're going to be using in learning plan number 4. And best wishes for working on this unit.